Thank you, and thanks to the organisers for the invitation. Wonderful to see so many people here, and it's 6 o'clock, learning about immunology. And 2011 marked the 30-year anniversary of the first cases of HIV, where young men in San Francisco, Los Angeles and New York were dying of a mysterious illness that we then came to know as AIDS. And 30 years later, in July 2011, the front cover of The Economist had a provocative title, "The End of AIDS, How 5 million lives have been saved and a plague could now be defeated." So what I want to share with you over the next 20 minutes or so is how we managed to go from an illness that was a universal death sentence to an infection that's really a chronic, manageable disease, the role that science played in that journey, and whether we will ever have an AIDS-free world. So just to first of all remind you of the scope of the problem, HIV infects 33 million people. There are 2.5 million new infections a year, and there are about 25 million people already who have died of HIV. And as you can see from this map, the prevalence of the number of people infected with HIV affects the poorest parts of the world, with parts of sub-Saharan Africa shown here in red having a prevalence of around 15 to 34%. And given that HIV predominantly infects young adults, this means that in some villages, in South Africa particularly, and around Durban, about 1 in 2 young adults are HIV infected. And so the impact that this infection has had on the economies and social networks of low-income countries has been absolutely extraordinary. But it's not all bad news. There have definitely been a number of incredible victories in our fight against HIV, and I'm going to share those first with you now. So shortly after the original descriptions of people dying of these weird illnesses, these young men dying of weird illnesses that we now know of AIDS, in 1983 HIV was identified as the cause of AIDS. And the discovery was made in France in the Pasteur Institute by a young postdoctoral fellow at the time, Françoise Barrès-Lucien, together with her boss Luc Montagnier, and they both were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2008 for the discovery of HIV. And Françoise identified HIV as the cause of AIDS because she took a lymph node from an infected patient and she put it into culture, and she recognised these were particles, round particles, emerging from the surface of the cell. And she recognised them because she'd been working on viruses for many years. She'd been working on a group of viruses called retroviruses, which we know have been around for years. In fact, our DNA is full of evidence of multiple infections with retroviruses. And she realised that this looked exactly like the retroviruses she had been studying, but it was a totally new virus, and then they identified this as HIV. Now, over the next 15 years, we learnt a hell of a lot about this virus. HIV is a retrovirus, but it's also a lentivirus, lenti being the Latin for slow, so it causes disease slowly. An absolutely brilliant strategy for an infectious disease, because people get infected and remain extremely well for about 10 years. And so then when they're highly infectious, they can go on to keep transmitting the virus. As opposed to an infection which makes you very sick very quickly, you have limited opportunity for transmission. We also learned that HIV infects and kills CD4 T cells, and you learned a little bit about CD4 T cells from the 2 previous speakers, and I thought Glenn's analogy of the T cell being the conductor of the orchestra of the immune system was a beautiful analogy, and CD4 T cells are critical for clearing viral infection. Second brilliant strategy by HIV, it primarily infects and kills the cell that generally protects us from viral infections. And as it kills the CD4 T cell, it slowly chips away and destroys the immune system. And it actually causes a lot more damage than the CD4 T cell. It causes damages in all the cells that we heard about from Robin in B cells, in monocytes, in dendritic cells. All arms of the immune system slowly get destroyed by HIV. It takes a while to get there, about 10 years to get there, and that's why people get sick. And there is an immune response to HIV, and we've actually learned quite a bit about it. In fact, it's been quite useful to study the immune response. But no one has an effective immune response to clear the virus. And this diagram shows you the immune response that actually every single person makes to HIV. So shortly after infection, every person infected will make an antibody. So again, we saw that earlier in Robin's slides, a classical response to a viral infection. You make an antibody which binds on the surface of the virus. That combination is recognised by infection fighting cells or cytotoxic T cells, and then it's eliminated from the circulation. So everyone makes an antibody who gets infected with HIV, but the antibodies are pretty useless. They don't do anything. And we often call these non-neutralising antibodies. So they're ineffective at clearing the virus. But the brilliant discovery in identifying these antibodies was that we could develop the HIV test. So when you go along to your doctor and have an HIV test, they're simply looking for the presence of an antibody. When the HIV test was discovered in 1984, this suddenly gave us a very powerful tool to identify who was infected and who wasn't. We therefore could understand the epidemiology, how and who was infectious and who was transmitting the virus. So the minute we got this test, we could dampen down the hysteria of transmission. And it basically saved our blood supply, because we could then test our blood supply and identify whether it contained infection or not. So this schematic diagram just basically shows you that everyone makes an immune response. They make antibodies. They also make these T cells that recognise virally infected cells, but no one can effectively clear the virus. People remain asymptomatic or well for up to 10 years with enormous amounts of virus in the system, and can therefore continue to transmit infection. And it's only once the immune system becomes damaged or the number of CD4 T cells reach a critically low level that we then see this entity called AIDS, which is really just a constellation of different unusual infections and cancers that we only see in the presence of HIV. But the next sort of major discovery that changed the face of HIV was the discovery of effective antiviral treatment. And we, over the last 30 years or so, have developed about 25 different drugs that can effectively block HIV replication. But the great discovery, and it's largely attributed to this man here, David Ho, who was named Time Man of the Year in 1996, because he recognised that in order to combat a virus like HIV, which is dividing and replicating so quickly, you needed to use more than one drug. You need to use a cocktail of drugs, or what we now call combination antiretroviral therapy. So if we use 3 drugs in combination, we could have a dramatic effect on the virus. And indeed, that's exactly what we're seeing. Once these drugs became available in 1996, patients that took these cocktail or combination antiretroviral therapy literally got off their deathbeds and went back to living a normal life. And this is how the drugs work. We can measure in patients that are not on treatment HIV in the blood, not the antibody response to HIV, but we can actually measure the virus itself. And we do this every day when we look after patients. We measure the actual number of viruses per ml of blood. And as soon as you put a patient on treatment, the virus, or the amount of viral load in blood, rapidly declines from literally millions of copies per ml down to levels that we can't detect with the assays that we currently use that detect 50 copies per ml. And this actually happens within about 2 to 3 weeks now with our current drugs. And at the same time, once you control the virus, the immune system can recover. I've just marked this blue line as immune function, but actually we generally measure number of CD4 T cells, a very easy test to do, and CD4 T cells rapidly return, and in most patients reach normal levels. So this was really a spectacular discovery. Of course, we know that antiretroviral therapy can't cure HIV, and whether you've been on treatment for 3 years or 25 years, as soon as you stop the medications, within about 2 to 3 weeks, the virus comes straight back. So at the moment, HIV is a chronic, manageable disease as long as you continue to take your drugs. And if you take your drugs well and take them every day, we actually even hardly see drug resistance. And the victories continued. Drug development proceeded at a rapid rate between 1996 until even today. Just like we have had access to new licensed drugs for HIV just in the last 24 months. But on the left is what patients took in 1996, on average about 30 tablets a day, with lots of side effects, very complicated medicine. And this is what people take in 2012. They take a single tablet that contains 3 different anti-HIV drugs. About 80% of the patients that we look after now will take a single tablet a day with excellent, durable control of HIV replication. At around this same time, it became apparent that most people that had the virus couldn't actually access treatment because treatment is quite expensive. And there's been an amazing commitment from global funders, really, from largely the American government and something called the Global Fund, to make antiretroviral therapy accessible to people that need it. And you can see in 2002, while we and Americans and Europeans were enjoying antiretroviral therapy, almost no one was on antiretroviral therapy in low and middle income countries. And in 2010, about 6.5 million, about 40% of people who need antiretroviral therapy are on it, which I think is really a major victory. One could argue that we still haven't quite met the targets that we should, but even to get these drugs into low and middle income countries has been quite a feat. And then what was considered to be the breakthrough of the year in Science magazine last year was the discovery that HIV treatment actually reduces infectiousness. So this was a study that took discordant heterosexual couples. I don't think this is a heterosexual couple. I'm sure it's not a heterosexual couple, but I thought it was a kind of cool way to explain what I mean by discordant, meaning one partner positive and one partner negative, mainly done in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the US. And they randomised, meaning they flipped a coin, and depending on whether you got heads or tails, you started treatment immediately for HIV, or the positive person waited until there were signs of immune damage, which is generally how we treat HIV, both here and in sub-Saharan Africa. And what the investigators found was if you treated people immediately, you reduced the risk of their partner getting HIV by 96%. So antiretroviral therapy not only saves the life of the person that's infected, it has a dramatic effect on its infectiousness.